So there are a series of milestones that will sort of help with that on that journey. Let me talk about a few of those. And for milestone number one is to set opening day expectations. And I can't overstate the importance of this, because expectations will kill you if you do them wrong. We were part of, when I was teaching at the seminary, Rick Warren had agreed to help us sponsor a new church in Louisville, Kentucky, and it's actually, it doesn't end well. It's one of the churches that didn't make it that they helped to sponsor. But this church was, and when Saddleback was involved in a new church plant, it's a big deal. I mean, it's kind of a well-known church plant, and they had this expectation that then they started talking about it, and they talked to their people, and they had a core of maybe 40, 50 people. I had helped. Saddleback had a pastor that they had suggested, and we interviewed him, felt good about him. And they wanted 500 at the first service, is what this pastor wanted. His name was Dale. We're going to have 500 at the first service. Well, and there's nothing wrong with 500 at the first service. Just recently down in Florida, a church planter friend of mine had 500 at the first service. So they started to get out there. We found a location. We found a hall, all this kind of stuff. Sent out all the mail. Did everything you're supposed to do. But 178 showed up at the first service. Now I got to tell you, I'd be pretty pleased with 178 people showing up at my first service. But the difficulty, when you had set the expectation way too high for the community, the church was demoralized and 9 months later was gone. Now, they could have done fine. If their expectation was 100, they would have been so excited about it, they would have dropped down to the 80s or 90s and pressed forward from there. You can't do the large launch everywhere. And the large launches that you've heard about 10 years ago, there's a reason you heard about them 10 years ago. Launches of that size are uncommon today. When we planted Lake Ridge, we made the determination we weren't going to do hundreds and hundreds at our first service, because we think where we are in North Georgia, where there are already large evangelical churches and a lot of church plants, that those who are going to respond to direct mail have already been hit 9 times by direct mail. And so for us, we just recognize that. And so I think the launch is a helpful tool, but you've got to have realistic expectations of what that's going to be. And that has to do with your community. Let me just tell you, the large launch does not work in rural communities. I shouldn't be so blanket. It usually doesn't work in rural communities, and here's why. The large launch assumes that there's a bunch of people who don't know you and don't know your church are going to show up as anonymous visitors on the first day. Well, if you're in a town of 5,000, everybody knows you, and everyone knows the people who are going to go. If you want to learn about rural church planting, the book to read is Big Dreams in Small Places, which is a book specifically on rural church planting in North America. It's a good resource. You get it at churchsmart.com. And that's a good resource. So it doesn't work in really small rural areas. It tends to be less effective in areas that are resistant to direct mail. In our case, we're not resistant to direct mail, but there's so much of it. So you've got to kind of think through, is that our strategy? And then set realistic expectations. How do you do that? Well, find out what other churches, remember back to our first session, find out what other churches in similar communities have done recently, and if the large launch has worked for them. And then, don't set unrealistic numerical goals, but have that expectation. And so you define opening day expectations, you define 3-month post-launch expectations, you define 1-year post-launch expectation. I think a lot of churches, I don't think this is a bad rule of thumb, but it might give you a rule of thumb to work from. A lot of churches will launch, and what they want is a year later for their average attendance to be the attendance at their launch. It's not a bad strategy, not a bad goal to shoot for, except if you do it on Easter Sunday. I actually don't encourage churches to launch on Easter Sunday. And the reason is that there's such an incredible letdown the week after that sometimes it's hard to recover. And soon you're into summer, which in most communities is a time when attendance goes down. Now, if you're going to launch in the spring, because you can't, if you show up in the summer before and you can't launch by the fall, then you're probably going to have to launch in the spring. I find the best days to actually launch on Palm Sunday, the Sunday before Easter, because then you've got a good attendance on Palm Sunday. They got to come back on Easter. I mean, it's the thing, and by then you've got a little bit of a pattern. So launches tend to be most effective on the spring and the fall in most communities. And the reason for that is that in most communities, church attendance increases or decreases like a 2-humped camel. Church attendance tends to go up in the fall, down in the winter, up in the spring, down in the summer. In most communities. I was consulting with a church recently in North Carolina, and their attendance tends to go way up in the summer and way down in the fall. Okay, but most communities, so whatever it is in your community, the time to launch your church, and really the time to launch new ministries as a whole, is when people are more open and receptive, when they're coming back to church, when they're trying new things, that hump in the fall and that hump in the spring. That's the time to do that, because then you build on that momentum. So launching new things when your people are on vacation more than any other just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, when does that work? Well, for the fall, that typically means September. It doesn't mean Labor Day. It could mean August, those of you who are back to school, but August, see, here's the thing. For the first week or so when people are into school, they're not looking to try new things. They're looking to get through the thing they just started. And the same thing is with Labor Day. People say, well, I want to launch after Labor Day. I encourage church planners to launch 2 weeks after Labor Day, because Labor Day, the last fling of the summer, and then people the next weekend are just trying to recover. So maybe mid-September to mid-October is kind of a good time to launch. This is just my observation for what it's worth. And also at springtime, Palm Sunday tends to be a good time to launch. Some churches have found more and more that the new year is a good time to launch. I was a little skeptical about that. Right at Y2K, several churches wanted to launch, and I was kind of concerned because I thought we'd all be in underground bunkers hoarding food. But they launched on that day, and it worked for them. A lot of people making that New Year's resolutions, health clubs do that. They say, come sign up, et cetera, et cetera. And so this became kind of tied into that. And here's what it is. It's tied into human need. And people have a need for community when they come back from being traveling, and that's why fall tends to work after summer, and spring, and also the beginning of the year may work. So those opening day expectations have to be set, and again, see that launch as part of that strategy.